thank you all for coming out here tonight to hear me talk about my writing. I assume that you know I am Flannery O'Connor by your being here, and you may already be familiar with my works, Wise Blood and A Good Man is Hard to Find, amongst other stories. I'm always glad to learn that other people enjoy my stories, or at least are morbidly interested. Sometimes I worry that I'm the only one who enjoys them, but people keep inviting me to give lectures or speak at their clubs, so the contrary must be true. But since you show an interest in my work, I presume you are all foreigners, as nobody in Georgia seems to show much interest. Southern people don't know anything about the literature of the South, unless they had gone to a northern college or some of the conscious places like Vanderbilt or Sewanee or Washington and Lee. Or at least that's my theory. Could we have all those who are not originally from the South here tonight? Please comment below and let me know. I like to test my theories. Now all those who were born and bred in Georgia, also leave a comment saying so. This will be quite interesting. Well, for whatever reason you have for being interested in what I write or have to say, I'm very glad you decided to come. Firstly, I would like to tell you that writing a novel is a terrible experience during which the hair often falls out and the teeth decay. I'm always irritated by people who imply that writing fiction is an escape from reality. It is a plunge into reality, and it's very shocking to the system. But not writing is a good deal worse than writing. I have been writing for as long as I can remember. Ever since I was a child, I had an interest in the literary arts, but I've always been an innocent speller. I just spell things how they sound, but so far people have been able to understand me. When writing, I believe that routine is a condition of survival. Every morning I get up at 6 and say my morning prayers. Then I share a thermos of coffee with my mother while we listen to the weather report on the radio. I go to Mass at the Sacred Heart. I sit on the right-hand side in the 5th row. Then I come back home and I begin writing. I try to devote a good part of my morning to writing, from 9 to noon. One of my early writing instructors had told me to set aside a certain number of hours to write in a day, and it's advice I follow to this day. I am a full-time believer in writing habits. You may be able to do without them if you have genius, but most of us only have talent. And this is simply something that has to be assisted at all times by physical and mental habits, or it dries up and blows away. I write about 3 pages in a day because, believe me, I work all the time, but I cannot work fast. No one can convince me I shouldn't rewrite as much as I do, and I may tear it all to pieces the next day. When I write, I don't use an outline. I just kind of feel it out like a hound dog. I follow the scent. Quite frequently, it is the wrong scent, and you stop and go back to the last plausible point and start in some other direction. I don't usually know how my stories are going to end. I knew how A Good Man is Hard to Find was going to end, but that was an exception that I puzzled out. With most stories, when you write the thing through once, you find out what the end is. Then you can go back to the first chapter and put in all those foreshadowings. I'm often asked what inspires my writing, and I must say that my Catholic faith very much inspires me, as it is the foundation of my life and our world. I write the way I do because I'm Catholic. This is a fact, and nothing covers it like a bland statement. I read a lot of theology too because I believe it makes my writing bolder. It reveals truths and helps shape my writing, as all of my writing is about the human condition as it relates to sin and redemption. And let me assure you, no one but a Catholic could have written Wise Blood, even though it is about some kind of Protestant saint. This is a subject that I'm particularly keen on and have given many lectures about, and I would like to read you some of my thoughts that I've written down about it. Christian novelist is distinguished from his pagan counterparts by recognizing sin as sin. According to his heritage, he sees it not as a sickness or an accident of the environment, but as a responsible choice of offense against God, which involves his eternal future. Either one is serious about salvation or one is not, and it is well to realize that the maximum amount of seriousness admits the maximum amount of comedy. Drama usually bases itself on the bedrock of original sin, whether the writer thinks in theological terms or not. Then, too, any character in a serious novel is supposed to carry a burden of meaning larger than himself. The novelist doesn't write about people in a vacuum. He writes about people in a world where something is obviously lacking, where there is the general mystery of incompleteness and the particular tragedy of our own times to be demonstrated, and the novelist tries to give you, within the form of a book, a total experience of human nature at any time. There is something in us as storytellers and as listeners of stories that demands redemptive act, that demands that what falls at least be offered the chance to be restored. The reader of today looks for this motion, and rightly so, but what he has forgotten is the cost of it. His sense of evil is diluted or lacking altogether, and so he has forgotten the price of restoration. When he reads a novel, he either wants his sense tormented or his spirits raised. He wants to be transported instantly, either to mock damnation or a mock of innocence. I'm also inspired by the place in which I grew up and live, the South, precisely Georgia. I was born in Savannah, Georgia, the product of the union of two of Georgia's oldest Catholic families. I can trace my ancestry all the way back to the early 1800s in Georgia, when the anti-Catholic laws were abolished. Oglethorpe believed in freedom of religion for everyone, except the papists. I was a pigeon-toed child with the receding chin and a "you leave me alone or I'll bite you" complex. When I was 5, I had a chicken that walked backward and was in the Pathé News. I was in it too with the chicken. I was just there to assist the chicken, but it was the high point in my life. Everything since has been anticlimax. And when I was 12, I made up my mind absolutely that I would not get any older. I don't remember how I meant to stop it, but I obviously have been unsuccessful. I spent most of my childhood in Savannah, but my father began to get sick in 37. In 38, we moved to Atlanta because my father had gotten a job as a Federal Housing Authority real estate appraiser, but that did not last for long. The next year, he was officially diagnosed with lupus, and my family had to move to Milledgeville to be with my mother's people as my father became unable to work. He did not live much longer than that. If you are a writer and the South is what you know, then it's what you'll write about, and how you judge it will depend on how you judge yourself. I'm often noted for my use of the Southern dialect, but if my characters speak Southern, it's because I do, not because I'm trying to have them sound a certain way. It's perhaps good and necessary to get away from it, the South that is, physically for a while, but this is by no means to escape it. I stayed away from the time I was 20 until I was 25 with the notion that the life of my writing depended on my staying away. I had lived in Connecticut before coming back here. I went north after graduating from the Georgia State College for Women with a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology and English Literature. I guess you could say I began my career there. I was the editor of the college's literary magazine, The Corinthian, my senior year. Then I attended the University of Iowa with a plan to study journalism, but I soon found myself in the Iowa Writers' Workshop, getting my Master's of Fine Arts. Everywhere I go, I'm asked if I believe the universities stifle writers. My opinion is they don't stifle enough of them. Anywho, while I was at the University of Iowa, I had my first story published, The Geranium, in the summer issue of Accent magazine. And despite what some ladies might think, it was not about how to care for your geranium, even though that is probably what a good young lady from the South should have been writing about in the opinion of some. In the summer of '48, after graduation, I was invited to Yaddo, an artist community in Saratoga Springs, New York. This is where I continued to work on my first novel, Wise Blood. Yaddo gave me a quiet place to work where I could focus on my writing. I didn't even have to worry about paying for room or board, as that was all covered by the foundation as part of my invitation. I also got to meet other writers while I was there, like Robert Lowell and Malcolm Cowley. They would read my work and give me their advice and opinions, which I found to be very helpful. After my time at Yaddo came to an end, I moved into the garage apartment of Sally and Robert Fitzgerald in Ridgefield, Connecticut. We became fast friends and still are to this day. They mostly left me alone to write, but provided companionship when I required it. I believe that I would certainly have persisted in the delusion that I had to stay away from the South had I not got very ill and had to come back home to Milledgeville. At first, I believed my illness to be rheumatoid arthritis. I now know that it is lupus, and I am very glad to know it. Lupus is one of those things in the rheumatic department. It comes and goes, and when it comes, I retire, and when it goes, I venture forth. My father had it some 12 to 15 years ago, and at that time, there was nothing for it but the undertaker. Now it can be controlled with the ACTH. I have enough energy to write with, and as that is all I have any business doing anyhow, I can with one eye squint take it all as a blessing. What you have to measure out, you come to observe closer, or so I tell myself. The best of my writing has been done here on my family farm, Andalusia. Mother is nuts about it here on the farm, surrounded by the lowing herd, and considers it beneficial to my health. Mother raises cows, and I raise ducks and pheasants. The pheasant cock has horns and looks like some of those devilish people and dogs in Rousseau's paintings. I have been taking painting myself, painting mostly chickens and guineas and pheasants. My mother thinks they're great stuff. She prefers me painting to me writing. I've bought me some peafowl and sit on the back steps a good deal studying them. I'm going to be the world authority on peafowl, and I hope to be offered a chair someday at the chicken college. My pea chicken has turned out to be a cock, which means that in 3 years, if he survives dogs, weasels, minks, and internal worms, he will have a tail spread of 4 feet. He has one trick. He runs up to anyone holding a cigarette and snatches it away and eats it. He has eaten 2 hot cigarettes so far. I can't imagine they taste good or are good for him, and I certainly don't want to find out myself. I suppose that my mother is one of those critics who finds my writing grotesque, like those Yankees. Of course, anything that comes out of the South is going to be called grotesque by the Northern reader, unless it is grotesque, and then it will be called realistic. My publisher, Harcourt, sent my book to another novelist, Evelyn Waugh, and his comment was, "If this is really the unaided work of a young lady, it is a remarkable product." My mother was vastly insulted. She put emphasis on if and lady. "Does he suppose you're not a lady?" she says. "Who is he?" She always wanted me to be a proper Southern lady, and I've always been horrified at the thought of becoming one. I do as I please, and I don't care if it's considered ladylike. If I followed the conventions of Southern womanhood, then I would not be up here speaking to you all today. As many of the old hens will tell you, anywho, it is not proper for a young lady to write such serious novels or be pursuing a career outside of the home. My kinfolks think I am a commercial writer now, and really they are proud of me. My Uncle Lewis is always bringing me a message from somebody at his company who had read Wise Blood. The last was, ask her why she don't write about some nice people. Lewis says, I told them you wrote what paid. One of my Atlanta cousins informed me that she had written a book review on Wise Blood for her class. She's in the 9th grade. Why, said I. Because, said she, I had to write about some book that sister wouldn't read. I asked her what she said about it. She said her cousin wrote this book, and then she said everything that was on the jacket. I guess my appearance does not match what my readers assume it to be. I was in Nashville a couple of weeks ago visiting the Cheneys and met a man who looked at me a while and said, that was a profound book. You don't look like you wrote it. Well, I mustered up my squattiest expression and snarled, well, I did. I most definitely did write it all on my own. I've got a brain and I know how to use it. A good many people don't know how to use their brains, and it is made for a sorry state of the world. When I was writing Wise Blood, I knew I was not writing a conventional novel, and I think that the quality of the novel drove precisely from the peculiarity or aloneness, if you will, of the experience I write from. Whenever I am asked why Southern writers particularly have a penchant for writing about freaks, I say it is because we still have the ability to recognize one. To be able to recognize a freak, you have to have some conception of the whole man, and in the South, the general conception of man is still, in the main, theological. Now that is a large statement, and it is dangerous to make it, for almost anything you say about Southern belief can be denied in the next breath with equal propriety. But approaching the subject from the standpoint of the writer, I think it is safe to say that while the South is heartily Christ-centered, it is most certainly Christ-haunted. The Southerner who isn't convinced of it is very much afraid that he may have been formed in the image and likeness of God. Ghosts can be very fierce and instructive. They cast strange shadows, particularly in our literature. In any case, it is when the freak can be sensed as a figure for our essential displacement that he attains some depth in literature. But I do not want to be lumped together with those that call themselves regional writers looking for local color. The woods are full of regional writers, and it is the great horror of every serious Southern writer that he will become one of them. Well, I've gone on enough. Let me read you an excerpt from one of my stories. A good man is hard to find. The grandmother didn't want to go to Florida. She wanted to visit some of her connections in East Tennessee, and she was seizing at every chance to change Bailey's mind. Bailey was the son she lived with, her only boy. He was sitting on the edge of his chair at the table, bent over the orange sports section of the journal. Now look here, Bailey, she said. See here, read this. And she stood with one hand on her thin hip and the other rattling the newspaper at his bald head. Here, this fellow that calls himself the Misfit is loose from the federal pen and headed toward Florida. And you read here what it says that he did to these people. Just you read it. I wouldn't take my children in any direction with a criminal like that loose in it. I couldn't answer to my conscience if I did. Bailey didn't look up from his reading, so she wheeled around and faced the children's mother, a young woman in slacks whose face was as broad and innocent as cabbage and was tied around with a green handkerchief that had 2 points on the top like rabbit's ears. She was sitting on the sofa feeding the baby his apricots out of the jar. The children have been to Florida before, the old lady said. You all ought to take them somewhere else for a change, so they will see different parts of the world and be broad. They never have been to East Tennessee. The children's mother didn't seem to hear her, but the 8-year-old boy, John Wesley, a stocky child with glasses, said, If you don't want to go to Florida, why don't you just stay at home? He and the little girl, June Starr, were reading the funny papers on the floor. She wouldn't stay home to be queen for a day, June Starr said without raising her yellow head. Yes, and what would you do if this fellow, the misfit, caught you? The grandmother asked. Well, I'd smack his face, John Wesley said. She wouldn't stay at home for $1 million, June Starr said. Afraid she'd miss something. She has to go everywhere we go. All right, miss, the grandmother said. Just remember that next time you want me to curl your hair. June Starr said. Her hair was naturally curly. The next morning, the grandmother was the first one in the car, ready to go. She had her big black valise that looked like the head of a hippopotamus in one corner, and underneath it she was hiding a basket with Pitty Sing, the cat, in it. She didn't intend for the cat to be left alone in the house for 3 days, because he would miss her too much, and she was afraid he might brush up against one of those gas burners and accidentally asphyxiate himself. His son Bailey didn't like to arrive at a motel with a cat. Well, she sat in the middle of the back seat with John Wesley and June Starr on either side of her. Bailey and the children's mother and the baby sat in front, and they left Atlanta at 8:45 with the mileage on the car at 55890. The grandmother wrote this down because she thought it would be interesting to say how many miles they had been when they got back. It took them 20 minutes to get to the outskirts of the city. The old lady settled herself comfortably, removing her white cotton gloves and putting them up with her purse on the shelf in front of the back window. The children's mother still had on slacks and still had her head tied up in a green handkerchief, but the grandmother had on a navy blue straw sailor hat with a bunch of white violets on the brim and a navy blue dress with a small white dot in the print. Her collars and cuffs were white organdy trimmed with lace, and her neckline she had pinned a purple spray of cloth violets containing a sachet. In case of an accident, anyone seeing her dead on the highway would know at once that she was a lady. She said she thought it was going to be a good day for driving, neither too hot nor too cold, and she cautioned Bailey that the speed limit was 55 miles an hour, and that the patrolmen hid themselves behind billboards and small clumps of trees and sped out after you before you had a chance to slow down. She pointed out interesting details in the scenery. Stone Mountain, the blue granite that in some places came up to both sides of the highway. The brilliant red clay banks, slightly streaked with purple, and the various crops that made rows of green lacework on the ground. The trees were full of silver white sunlight, and the meanest of them sparkled. The children were reading comic magazines, and the mother had gone back to sleep. "Let's go through Georgia fast so we don't have to look at it much," John Wesley said. "Well, if I were a little boy," said the grandmother, "I wouldn't talk about my native state that way. Tennessee has the mountains, and Georgia has the hills." "Well, Tennessee is just a hillbilly dumping ground," John Wesley said, "and Georgia is a lousy state too." You said it, June Star said. In my time, said the grandmother, folding her thin, veined fingers, children were more respectful of the native states and their parents and everything else. People did right then. I'm sure some of you have read the story and know how it ends. I'm sure some others of you have not read it and still know how it ends. The stories I write are hard, but they are hard because there is nothing harder or less sentimental than Christian realism. When I see these stories described as horror stories, I am always amused because the reviewer always has hold of the wrong horror. I'm now happy to answer any questions you may have. Last week I lectured in Macon, and a club lady asked me if I knew Tennessee Williams was from Tennessee or not. I have to tell you, I did not know, and I told her such. But I was able to look it up and can now tell you that Tennessee Williams was not from Tennessee. He was born in Mississippi, and his name when he was born was Thomas Lanier Williams III. So you're welcome to ask your questions now, and please ask me things I know, or I'll just tell you I don't, and that's not as much fun.